1 minute ago, the story in Washington changed, not with theatrics or partisan bluster, but with something far more consequential. A legal line finally drawn. The Supreme Court has rejected Donald Trump's latest appeal, and for the first time in a long while, the message coming out of the judicial system is unmistakable. This isn't noise. This isn't delay. This is a moment where accountability stopped being theoretical and started becoming real. And while politicians scramble to spin it, the most revealing reaction didn't come from a rally, a press secretary, or a cable news panel. It came from a corner of American life that watches instability like hawks watch storms. The world of capital, markets, and long-term investment. For years now, Trump's entire post-presidency strategy has rested on one central idea, that the presidency itself is a shield, that if you were powerful enough when you acted, the law should hesitate, or even refuse to touch you later. It's a simple argument, dressed up in constitutional language, but rooted in something much older than modern law. The belief that position equals protection. If accepted, it wouldn't just change Trump's fate, it would permanently alter how power works in America. And that's why this moment matters so deeply, not just politically, but systemically. From the very beginning of his legal troubles, Trump didn't prepare for trial the way most defendants do. He prepared for delay. Delay through a procedural delay by reframing criminal exposure as political persecution. His legal team wasn't built to argue facts in a courtroom as much as to test the outer limits of immunity itself. Every filing carried the same subtext. If we can't win outright, we can at least push this beyond reach, beyond elections, beyond relevance, beyond consequence. And until now, that strategy had worked more often than people realize. Cases slowed, proceedings froze, courts hesitated. The system itself seemed unsure how to handle a former president who refused to behave like one. But today's decision changes that psychological balance, because what the court is signaling isn't just disagreement with one appeal. It's exhaustion with the entire premise that the presidency grants lifelong protection from accountability. To understand why this hits so hard, you have to look at the bigger structure Trump built around himself. His campaign apparatus slowly transformed into a legal defense machine. Donations that once fueled get-out-the-vote operations began underwriting motions, filings, and appellate briefs. Public messaging stopped being about policy futures and started revolving around legal survival. Trump wasn't just running for office. He was running from consequence. And the courts were the final gate. That's what makes this rejection so important. It's not loud, it's not theatrical. It's procedural, matter-of-fact, and devastating precisely because of that. The court didn't need to lecture. It didn't need dramatic flourishes. By refusing to step in and rescue the appeal, it allowed the legal process to restart its forward motion. Trials don't happen in slogans. They happen when delay ends. Within legal circles, the meaning was immediately understood. Appeals exist to correct error, not to create immunity where none has ever existed. The Constitution is explicit about impeachment not barring criminal liability, meaning the founders clearly anticipated presidents being prosecuted after leaving office. Absolute immunity was never a founding principle. It was a modern invention stretched to its breaking point by political desperation. Today, that stretch snapped, but while Washington focused on courtroom implications, something else was happening quietly and quickly. Markets were reacting, not with fear, but with relief. And that's where Warren Buffett enters the picture. Buffett is not known for impulsive commentary. He doesn't chase headlines. He doesn't react emotionally to political drama. For decades, his philosophy has been almost stubbornly consistent. Markets need predictability, trust, and the rule of law. Not favoritism, not exceptions, not uncertainty, and especially not systems that bend depending on who holds power at a given moment. From that lens, the court's decision wasn't about Trump. It was about precedent. Because when a legal system starts carving out special exemptions for the powerful, capital pulls back. Long-term investment hesitates. Trust erodes. Buffett has built an empire betting on the opposite, that contracts matter, laws apply evenly, and institutions outlive individuals. When those assumptions come under threat, you don't just get political instability, you get economic fragility. That's why this moment crossed into market consciousness so quickly. It reassured investors that the American legal system, while slow and strained, is still anchored to a fundamental principle. No one is structurally untouchable. For Wall Street, that matters more than who wins an election cycle. It tells businesses that tomorrow won't suddenly operate under unpredictable rules written to serve a single personality. And that contrast is important, because Trump's worldview has always differed sharply from Buffett. Trump believes leverage comes from pressure, forcing institutions to choose between bending and chaos. Buffett believes leverage comes from stability, building systems so reliable that chaos becomes unprofitable. Where Trump thrives in constant conflict, Buffett thrives in quiet continuity. And today, that difference became visible. What we're watching now is not the end of a legal story, but the end of a legal illusion. The illusion that courts would indefinitely pause reality out of fear of political repercussion. The illusion that time itself could protect a defendant from accountability. The illusion that the presidency was a crown rather than a public trust. When those illusions collapse, the consequences move quickly. In the coming days, Trump's options narrow. Without the protective bubble of appellate delay, lower courts regain momentum. Schedules firm up. Judges stop waiting. Prosecutors proceed. For the first time, Trump faces something he has historically avoided, a system that won't negotiate its own authority away. This is why the reaction feels so intense, even for those who expected it. Because once immunity arguments fail, every other defense has to stand on facts rather than status. And facts don't respond to rallies. Facts don't read polling. Facts don't care how loudly someone declares victimhood. Facts sit quietly in evidence folders, waiting for juries. And that's the moment Buffett, and markets like his, care about most. Not because they root for outcomes, but because they depend on process. Predictable process. Impersonal process. Impersonal process that doesn't flinch under pressure. When process holds, systems hold. When systems hold, confidence holds. And when confidence holds, economies function. So this isn't just a political headline. It's a structural checkpoint. A reminder that power in America is still supposed to rotate, not entrench itself. That courts are meant to adjudicate, not accommodate. And that the presidency, whatever mythology surrounds it, remains a job, not a license. Now that the Supreme Court has refused to step in, the legal terrain shifts dramatically. What had been frozen by appeals and procedural limbo begins to move again. And in the justice system, movement is everything. Delay is a strategy, motion is reality. Trump's legal posture was never about winning on the merits alone. It was about staying suspended above consequence for as long as possible. Today's decision ends that suspension, and what follows is a chain reaction his team can no longer easily control. At the heart of this moment is a simple but dangerous gamble Trump made years ago. He assumed that courts, like political actors, respond to pressure, loyalty, and precedent bending. In business terms, it was a high-leverage bet. If immunity held, everything collapsed in his favor. If it failed, there was no hedge. And unlike corporate risk, there was no diversification here. Every federal case depended on the same legal myth. Absolute immunity was the keystone. Remove it, and the entire structure weakens at once. From a practical standpoint, the immediate effect is procedural acceleration. Lower courts that were effectively waiting for guidance are no longer restrained. Scheduling conferences resume. Motions that had been paused move forward. Judges now armed with clarity read their dockets. This doesn't mean verdicts tomorrow, but it means momentum. And in criminal law, momentum favors the side prepared to present evidence, not the side hoping the clock runs out. Trump's team understood this risk. That's why they argued immunity in absolutist terms. There was no attempt to carve out nuance, no concession to limits, no acknowledgement of hypothetical crimes that clearly fall outside presidential duties. That rigidity wasn't about principle. It was about necessity. Once you admit any boundary, you invite inquiry. Once you invite inquiry, you invite juries. And juries are the one audience Trump cannot command. This is where Buffett-style thinking becomes useful. In Buffett's world, durability matters more than dominance. Businesses don't fail because of loud crises. They fail because of quiet structural weaknesses that were ignored too long. Trump's weakness has always been legal structure. He treats law like branding, something you can frame, message, overwhelm. But law, unlike media cycles, compounds. Small rulings accumulate, missed appeals stack, and eventually the math catches up. Inside Trump's legal operation, this moment triggers a recalibration that cannot be spun publicly. Lawyers now have to prepare for actual litigation timelines rather than theoretical rescues. That means witness lists, evidentiary disputes, suppression hearings, jury selection strategy, the unglamorous mechanics Trump has avoided his entire career by settling, delaying, or countersuing. This time, settlement isn't available, delay is favored, and counterpressure doesn't move judges the way it moves opponents in business or politics. The financial implications are immediate as well. Legal defense at this scale is extraordinarily expensive, especially when multiple cases advance simultaneously. Trump's fundraising machine has already been strained by overlapping obligations, campaign costs layered on top of mounting legal bills. But legal fees compound faster than political donations, particularly when courts no longer entertain indefinite delay. Every hearing costs, every motion costs, every trial day costs. And unlike campaign spending, legal spending doesn't inspire, it drains. This is one reason markets quietly exhaled, not because investors care about Trump personally, but because prolonged uncertainty is corrosive. An unresolved constitutional standoff at the highest level introduces doubt into the system about executive accountability, about prosecutorial authority, about the reliability of institutions. When that doubt clears, even if the process is messy, markets prefer it. Process is predictable. Chaos isn't. Here's the deeper issue many people miss. The immunity argument was never just defensive. It was prospective. If it had succeeded, it would have normalized a future where presidents operate with criminal impunity, knowing accountability can be litigated away indefinitely. That kind of precedent would fundamentally alter incentive structures in government. Power would attract those least constrained by ethics because the risk of consequence would evaporate. From an investor standpoint, that's not strength, that's systemic decay. Buffett has warned for decades that when incentives skew, outcomes follow. He talks about a culture not as a buzzword, but as a risk variable. In this context, a culture where leaders believe law applies selectively destabilizes everything beneath it. Regulations, contracts, enforcement, dispute resolution. Once that belief spreads, compliance becomes optional and trust becomes fragile. Economies don't collapse overnight from that, but they erode quietly. Trump's belief system runs counter to this understanding. He equates survival with dominance, staying on a fence, attacking institutions before they corner him. But institutions move differently. Courts absorb attacks without responding emotionally. They issue rulings on paper weeks later in neutral language that changes reality without matching volume. That asymmetry is why his approach falters here. You can shout at politics. You can't intimidate procedure. What makes this phase especially perilous for Trump is that political insulation weakens once legal inevitability sets in. Allies reassess risk. Donors reconsider exposure. Candidates down ballot calculate association costs. Legal vulnerability has a way of clarifying loyalties. When survival requires defending behavior rather than policy, coalitions thin quickly. This isn't ideological. It's practical. And unlike earlier moments, there is no external force left to interrupt the process. No higher court to appeal to. No institutional delay remaining. Everything now flows downhill to trial courts, where rules are clearer and theatrics less effective. Trump's public messaging may grow louder as a result, but volume cannot substitute for jurisdiction. This is also where time, previously Trump's ally, flips direction. Each passing month now tightens rather than loosens pressure. Election calendars collide with court calendars. Campaign strategy collides with trial preparation. Every appearance carries risk. Statements can be used, rhetoric can inflame juries, attacks on judges can backfire procedurally. The very instincts that built Trump's political brand become liabilities inside a courtroom environment. From a systems perspective, this is the correction phase. When an entity grows by overriding constraints, it eventually meets one it can't bypass. For Trump, that constraint isn't voters or media. It's law operating without deference. Buffett would call this a reversion to fundamentals. When fundamentals reassert themselves, speculation ends. In the next, we'll examine how this collision affects the broader political landscape, the 2024 election, Republican strategy, and why institutional stability may become the central theme whether campaigns want it or not. What happens now isn't just about Trump's fate. It's about whether Americans reward chaos or recalibration when power finally meets limits. As the legal pathway narrows for Trump, the political consequences widen. What began as a courtroom issue now reshapes the terrain of the entire 2024 race, not through slogans or campaign ads, but through perception. Elections are rarely decided by one event. They're decided by narratives that harden over time. And the narrative crystallizing now is not about policy or ideology. It's about stability versus chaos, systems versus personality, accountability versus exemption. For Republican leaders, this moment presents a structural dilemma they've tried to postpone for years. Trump's influence within the party remains powerful, but it has always come with a cost that many hope courts would quietly resolve for them. If the legal system had insulated Trump, Republicans could continue rallying around him while avoiding direct ownership of his actions. That exit ramp is gone. Each advancing trial forces a choice: defend the man or defend the institution. This dilemma is already showing fractures beneath the surface. Publicly, many party figures still offer cautious loyalty. Privately, anxiety dominates. Strategists understand that undecided and suburban voters don't process legal chaos the way hardcore supporters do. They don't see it as persecution, they see it as instability. And while polarization energizes bases, it repels swing coalitions, the ones elections are actually won with. Trump's instinctive response has been escalation, attacking judges, attacking courts, framing loss as betrayal. This approach reinforces allegiance among those already committed, but it hardens opposition elsewhere. Every attack on legal institutions converts a legal proceeding into a referendum on the rule of law itself. That may feel instinctively powerful, but structurally it's self-defeating. Most Americans may distrust politicians, but they still rely on systems. When someone signals they reject those systems entirely, people listen, and not always favorably. Here's where the Warren Buffett contrast becomes more than symbolic. Buffett has always argued that societies function best when rules are clear and enforcement is boring. Boring systems create confidence, confidence attracts capital, capital fuels growth. From this vantage point, Trump's posture doesn't look strong. It looks risky. Not risky in a theatrical sense, but in the quiet way, risk accumulates underneath economies, alliances, and elections. That's why Trump's legal exposure now bleeds directly into economic trust. Business leaders don't want outcomes. They want frameworks they can rely on regardless of who holds office. A campaign built around attacking the courts introduces ambiguity. What happens to contracts? To regulations? To enforcement norms? The more Trump frames accountability as illegitimate, the more that ambiguity grows. Democrats understand this, and they will lean into it relentlessly, but not emotionally. Strategically, expect less outrage and more contrast, less shouting and more framing. The message won't be a Trump is dangerous. It will be a systems matter. They will argue that normal governance depends on leaders who accept limits, defer to law, and move forward without pulling institutions into constant conflict. Most voters don't live inside political news cycles. They absorb impressions. They notice tone. They notice fatigue, and fatigue has become Trump's quiet opponent. Years of perpetual confrontation have worn thin for many Americans who once tolerated it as disruption, but now see it as instability. Legal proceedings amplify that exhaustion. Courtrooms drain drama. They replace spectacle with waiting, process, and judgment. This dynamic changes Trump's strongest political weapon, grievance, into something more fragile. Grievance thrives on stasis, on unresolved tension. Trials resolve things. Even before verdicts, they impose structure, timelines, rules, consequences for violation. Once inside that structure, Trump is no longer the author of reality. He's a participant, and participation is not his preferred arena. The Republican Party, meanwhile, faces a parallel identity struggle. Is it the party of institutions or of individuals, of law or of loyalty? For years, those questions were abstract. Now they are immediate. Candidates down the ballot must decide whether to tie themselves to a man whose legal future dominates headlines or to distance themselves and risk backlash from his base. Neither choice is clean, but delay favors Trump less now than ever before. At the same time, independent voters, the quiet center of the electorate, are watching signals, not speeches. They notice when markets stabilize after judicial clarity. They notice when business leaders speak about rule of law rather than personalities. They notice when chaos coincides with falling confidence. These signals operate below the level of partisanship. They shape mood rather than debate. This is why the coming months are less about persuasion and more about contrast. One side argues that power should be unrestrained, defended aggressively, loyal to individuals. The other argues that power must submit to law, even when inconvenient. That distinction may not excite crowds, but it reassures households, investors, and institutions that plan beyond election cycles. Trump's challenge is that his brand resists moderation. Acceptance of limits reads as weakness to his core supporters. Yet rejection of limits alienates everyone else. This is not a messaging problem, it's a structural trap. Once absolute immunity fails, there is no graceful retreat. Every path forward exacts a cost. And here's the deeper reality many avoid acknowledging. The legal system doesn't need to defeat Trump publicly to neutralize his influence. It only needs to proceed. Each motion heard, each schedule set, each ruling issued quietly shifts focus away from spectacle and toward consequence. Slowly, the center of gravity moves away from rallies and back to institutions. That recentering matters more than any individual outcome. When moments like this arrive, they are often misunderstood in real time. People look for spectacle, a single ruling, a dramatic arrest, a definitive headline, and miss the quieter shift that actually defines the era. What is happening now is not a sudden collapse, but a reassertion. Power is being reminded of its boundaries. And in functioning systems, boundaries are what keep everything else standing. For Donald Trump, this phase represents the most dangerous kind of reckoning precisely because it is not political. Political fights can be reframed, delayed, reversed by elections. Legal processes cannot. They advance steadily, indifferent to rhetoric or rallies. Once courts resume motion, the machinery moves forward whether anyone likes it or not. That's the part Trump has never fully absorbed, because his career has always depended on bending structures, not submitting to them. This is why the Supreme Court's refusal to intervene resonates far beyond the courtroom. It signals that institutional patience has limits, not ideological limits, but functional ones. Courts can tolerate controversy. What they cannot tolerate is being turned into shields for permanent exception. When that happens, legitimacy erodes, and legitimacy is the court's currency. Today, the court chose to protect its own role rather than any individual. That choice may anger some, but it preserves the system for everyone else. From an economic perspective, this is exactly the correction long-term investors expect. Markets are not allergic to conflict, they are allergic to unpredictability. Uncertainty about enforcement, accountability, and succession creates risk premiums no business wants to price. When the rule of law reasserts itself, those premiums shrink. Confidence doesn't require perfect outcomes. It requires consistent process. This is why Warren Buffett's perspective matters here, not because he is a political figure, but because he understands systems over personalities. His entire philosophy rests on the assumption that America endures because its institutions outlast its leaders. Courts function. Contracts are honored. Disputes are resolved through law rather than force. That belief underwrites trillions of dollars in investment. When it is challenged, the ripple travels far beyond politics. Trump's worldview clashes with that foundation. He treats institutions as extensions of loyalty, useful if supportive, corrupt if resistant. That mindset works in personal empires but fails in public governance. A country is not a brand and law is not a marketing obstacle. Eventually, systems push back, not loudly, persistently. What we are likely to see next is not a sudden collapse of Trump's influence, but a gradual narrowing of his options. Campaign time collides with court time. Messaging collides with evidence. Loyalty tests collide with legal risk. Each collision constrains movement. Each constraint increases pressure, and pressure reveals fracture. This is also why the next phase will feel slower but heavier. There will be fewer dramatic announcements and more procedural updates. Pretrial hearings, motions argued and denied, schedules set. Each step reinforces the same message. Normal rules are back in effect. That normalization is quietly transformative. It reduces spectacle. It drains oxygen from outrage. It shifts attention from personality to structure. Normalization arrives at an uncomfortable moment. For years, leadership bet that Trump's legal issues would either disappear or remain abstract enough to ignore. That bet no longer holds. Candidates must now decide whether to tether their futures to a man increasingly defined by court dates rather than policy platforms. Some will double down. Others will distance themselves silently. But the party will not remain unified forever under that strain. Meanwhile, independent voters, often overlooked in noisy media cycles, absorb a simpler message. They see a country correcting course rather than spiraling. They see courts functioning despite pressure. They see boundaries enforced without drama. For many, this matters more than ideology. Stability becomes a political value in its own right. This is how democracies usually recover from periods of stress. Not through cathartic moments, but through institutional follow-through. Elections matter, courts matter, rules matter. When citizens see those elements still operating, the sense that the system is bigger than any single figure slowly returns. That restoration of confidence cannot be rushed, but it compounds over time. For Trump, the greatest irony is that the same structures he once claimed to represent strength are now testing him. The Constitution he invoked as a shield is functioning as a limit. The courts he expected loyalty from are asserting independence. The delays he relied on are evaporating. What remains as substance is unforgiving. This doesn't guarantee outcomes. Courts decide cases on evidence, not narratives, but it guarantees process, and in systems designed to endure, process is the real power. It is what protects citizens from the excesses of individuals, no matter how influential those individuals become. When process holds, democracy breathes. So this moment is not about revenge or vindication, it's about recalibration, a rebalancing between ambition and accountability, between personal power and public trust, between the desire to dominate and the necessity to govern. When those forces drift too far apart, correction becomes inevitable. What happens next will be slower, quieter, and far more consequential than headlines suggest. The noise will continue: attacks, fundraising emails, rallies framed as resistance. But underneath the noise, the system is moving forward. And once systems regain forward motion, they rarely reverse themselves for convenience. The larger lesson here is one Buffett has articulated his entire life, even outside politics. When you build on solid foundations, patience wins. Short-term disruptions fade. Loud personalities come and go. What remains are the rules everyone agreed to live by, especially when doing so is uncomfortable. America is now testing that agreement again. And for the first time in a long while, the answer from its institutions is clear.